Good afternoon. I'm Don Chu, editor of the Journal of Applied Corporate Finance, and it's my great honor and privilege to interview Michael Jensen, Harvard professor emeritus and well-known finance scholar and distinguished teacher for the AFA series. So what we'd like to do today is try to go back in the past and find out how Mike came up with some of these ideas and the path that he's taken to reach his current concerns, which are quite different from those things that he started with in the past. Now let's go back to Mike's University of Chicago education. You had a course with Gene Fama that has in some sense changed the finance world in dramatic ways. Can you tell us about what happened in that course and how and what happened as a result of it?
Yeah, that was, I don't remember the title of the course. I think it was something like investments, but efficient market theory was just being born at that time. Markowitz was doing his work on portfolio theory, and Bill Sharp was doing his work on capital asset pricing models. And Gene was covering a lot of that in the course, and we were assigned to do term paper. And Richard Roll, who I was very fortunate to have as a fellow doctoral student and shared an office with him, and I decided to write a paper, and that's how that paper on stock splits and event studies all came about.
And the idea of studying the effect of a transaction by looking at the stock price reaction was a novel idea at that time. Can you tell us how you came up with the notion that you can evaluate the profitability of a transaction just by looking at the stock market response?
Well, we were struggling with that problem, how the stock market response would be an obvious way to look at it, but how did you actually separate out what was due to the event, whatever it was, in this case the announcement of a stock split, from everything else that was going on in the world? And I remember driving down 95th Street on my way home one day after many discussions and arguments with Dick. He was a great co-author, and it suddenly hit me that we ought to run this, what's now called CAPM regression, and look at the residuals from that equation, the statistical residuals. And that would have taken care of the effects of market movements. Now that's a very crude model, and it's been improved dramatically since then. And Dick was a genius at computers, and he was the first person other than Larry Fisher, I believe, to make use of the database at the Center for Research and Security Prices at the University of Chicago, which had just then come up and been available to the outside world. Without Dick, it would have never gotten done. And Gene liked the paper, and then he joined as a co-author, and we eventually got it published in some unknown journal called the International Economic Review. The reason, of course, was that nobody in the finance profession at that time thought this had any value.
The event study methodology, was that instantly accepted by the profession upon publication, or did it take several years and then suddenly go through a flood of acceptances in general use? Or
there was relatively little controversy about that innovation. As I recall, my memory isn't all that good, but it seemed to other doctoral students and other people began to pick it up and use it for measuring the effect of events on asset prices and portfolios of assets. And it was vastly improved on by others and became a standard statistical technique used for figuring out what actually affected stock prices and how.
Yeah.
So unlike many others, the natural response in most professions is somebody invents something new, is we reject it. And in fact, it was rejected by the finance scholars of the day, the old guys who were, that's how like we thought about them, as the old guys who were running the American Finance Association and the Journal of Finance. And
was that because these people presumably didn't believe in market efficiency, didn't believe that the stock market reaction could possibly contain that kind of assessment of the value of a transaction, or?
Well, Kuhn wrote an entire book about this entitled The Structure of Scientific Revolutions. And the basic thesis of that book, with lots of examples, is that scholars and scientists don't actually create new things, although that's what we're supposed to be doing. What we run is tests and that prove that the theories that we currently accept are in fact right. And so this was a lot of new stuff hitting the finance profession at in a very small period of time. And Modigliani Miller work was going on at about this time too. And the what we refer to as the old line finance guys, the finance professors from around the world who were running the journals and the profession, quite understandably weren't wildly enthusiastic about this stuff. It didn't occur to them as finance. You know, what is this stuff about regressions and all of that kind of stuff? So it's a common event.
Let's move on to your second, to your doctoral thesis, which was on mutual fund performance. Can you tell us how which ended up creating a measure of performance called Jensens Alpha, which today is widely used in the investment community? Can you tell us about how you got the idea to come up with such a performance measure?
Well, it was kind of a natural outgrowth of what we were doing at the time and what was going on. This made more explicit use of the capital asset pricing model to figure out what, given the general market movements, what the return on a portfolio should have been adjusted for its risk level. And prior to that time, we had no good way of measuring risk. So suddenly we could use that simple market model regression and the intercept on the market index called beta. So we could use that to control for risk. Now there's an intercept in that equation called alpha. And when I ran that regression on 115 mutual fund portfolios, both gross of and net of the fund fees and the transactions costs, it turned out that nobody could outperform the market.
Nobody?
Nobody.
Or...
Well, there were random events, but nobody systematically outperformed the market, and the industry as a whole was substantially below the market by the amount of their
And were you surprised
fees.
by these results?
No, because at that time there was a small group of us who thought that there was a lot of evidence that hadn't yet been uncovered that indicated that market prices were very efficient and good at incorporating all the available information. So a natural thing to do was to look at mutual funds and see how well professional managers did. And they didn't do very well. It was actually as a result of that I was fortunate to meet Fisher Black and Bill Sharp, who I had never met before but heard of him, who invented the capital asset pricing model along with John Lintner.
So Mike, the idea that the professional investors fail to beat the market systematically must have come as quite a shock to the investment community at that time. Did you receive a lot of hate mail or articles in the press saying that either in favor of or adamantly opposed to your ideas?
In the initial stages, I don't think it got a lot of attention in the public press. You know, I gave it at the annual American Finance Association meetings, the paper, and it eventually got published in the Journal of Finance, the AFA's journal. But there wasn't a lot of outcry. You know, it was kind of under the radar. But it got a lot of academics interested in it, and some professionals, and then there became a flurry of activity and a lot of research done on the topic. In those days, all that data had to be hand collected from printed sheets in the library, and then it became much easier. And some people went into the business of producing measures of portfolio performance, and
some people went into the business of producing index funds. Now let's go back in time to the famous Jensen and Meckling paper. Again, probably the most cited paper in all of corporate finance, which ended up revolutionizing the field. How did you come to focus on the conflict of interest between managers and shareholders that's at the heart of that theory?
it was an accident, actually. Carl Brunner who had become our colleague. He was a major figure in macroeconomics and a professor at the University of Bern in Bern, Switzerland.
An advisor to Margaret Thatcher during the Thatcher era. Right?
Is that right?
Yeah.
I'd forgotten that. And he had joined, and he had started a set of conferences called the Interlochen Conferences, in which he brought a number of faculty members, major people from the U.S., and economists, and guys like Armin Alchin and Alan Meltzer and some others, to Interlaken to be mixed up with a bunch of European economists, and a lot of them in those days were socialists, if not outright communists. And Carl had this goal to change the way they thought about economics, and to maybe those of us in the U.S. could learn some things outside of our own insulated environment too. And after that had been going on for a couple of years, it was in the early 70s, and paper was published in 1976. It was in the early 70s that Carl prevailed on us to give a controversial lecture that somewhat along the lines of what Milton Friedman's article in the New York Times Magazine was at about the same time.
Right.
The business of business is to make a profit, or something like that.
The social function of the corporation is to
Yeah.
maximize value. Yeah.
And so Bill and I decided to create a paper that would deliver that message and how we thought about economics in the firm to this mixed audience in Europe that probably wouldn't like it very much. Before we gave the paper, and the more we got into it, the more we were left feeling somewhat helpless, because the more we broke open this black box of the firm, which had been, to that time, the way people thought about firms was they were maximizing entities that behaved so as to maximize value, and that competition would ensure that, between firms, would ensure that that's the way they behave. Well, as Bill and I began to analyze that, and in putting together our case, we decided that couldn't possibly be true. That is, if you actually break open the black box of the firm and see everybody in it as self-interested, maximizing individuals, the likelihood that they would behave as though a simple maximizing outcome at the top would occur was close to zero. And so that was a real shock. And then we said, well, now what are we going to do with this mess? And we began to work on creating a structure which would allow us to make predictions about what was happening and how it would evolve. And we focused on the conflicts of interest between managers who were not 100% owners of the firm, and shareholders and bondholders, and the conflicts between bondholders and shareholders, and that developed eventually into a 100+ page paper. We got very excited about it. We thought we'd really created some great stuff, and then we gave a seminar to our colleagues. Now, he was the dean, and I was just, by that time, maybe an associate professor, I don't remember. But we gave it to our colleagues. I'll never forget that day. They hated it. It was at the University of Rochester Business School.
So what you're telling me then, Mike, is that this paper, which has been cited almost 20,000 times, probably the most cited paper in all the corporate finance literature, was hated by your colleagues when it was first introduced in seminar. How do you explain that, or what was going on?
It was not a mild reaction. I mean, they accused us of being wrong. They accused us of plagiarizing Armin Alchin. We had a couple of his students on the faculty. I will never forget that day. You know, Bill and I had this brand new baby, and we thought it was beautiful, and we brought it to them, and they ran us out on a rail. And after the seminar, it's seared in my memory. We silently walked out of the room, up to his office, and he had a big desk, and he he smoked these big black cigars, and he sat down behind the desk, and I sat on the other side on a couch, put his feet up on the desk. He pulled out this big cigar and lit it, and he said, "We sure didn't sell that one, Michael." And I said, "We sure didn't." And
I'm not sure
sorry, that was the first really recognition that I had, that I've had to teach all of my doctoral students, and since then, that if you ever really do come up with a great new idea, and you are going to think people will love it, but they won't. Almost never do they. You know, it didn't end there. Eventually, we brought them around, but when people see something new, it threatens them. It threatens their ideas and the structure they work with. And it's what Kuhn says, you know, scientists don't really want to discover new things. They want to prove that the way we think about the world is right. And, you know, the behavioral finance guys have gotten the same kind of rejections. And later, when I went to give the paper at the University of Chicago, my alma mater, with Gene Fama and Merton Miller and my old faculty members and friends who were still in the doctoral program, I got the same reaction. I mean, they hated it. They didn't just not like it, they hated it. Now, I do have to say that I caused some of that reaction because at that time, sort of the Bible for corporate finance was the Fama Miller book. It had been out a few years, called The Theory of Finance, and it was in a white cover. And it's a very, very good book. And when Gene, who introduced me to the seminar, I believe that day, or maybe it was Fisher Black, he gave the title of the paper, and I started the seminar by saying the paper has a subtitle. And what's the subtitle? The subtitle is "Why Chapter 4 of the White Bible is All Wrong." And with that, Merton and Gene came up out of their chairs, and it was a replay of what I had at Rochester. And it didn't stop there, because we worked on it for another 4, maybe 5 years. And finally, we sent it off to the Bell Journal of Economics, which was edited by Oliver Williamson at that time. And we got back a referee's report, 2 referees, and a letter from Ollie rejecting it. And the referees were outraged by the paper, much like our colleagues, without my remark, of course. They said it wasn't even a sensible proposal for a paper, much less a real paper. And so Bill and I were sitting around wondering what to do, and because we thought, you know, would be readily accepted. And while we were puzzling over that, and over a period of literally less than a week, Gene Fama, who was on leave visiting in Belgium for the year, had gotten a hold of the current version of the paper, maybe through the working paper series, and sent an unconditional letter of acceptance as editor of the JFE to publish the paper in the JFE. And so for about 10 minutes, I felt a little awkward, since I was the editor publishing my own paper. But, you know, Bill and I had a conversation, and I said, you know, this is going to be a great paper, and I think it's going to help the journal. So let's publish it there, and I think I'll make it the lead article. And the rest is history.
Like, what do you think, what was it about Jensen and Meckling that caused such resistance? Was it the idea that it implied that managers were not maximizing the value of firms for shareholders, or was it the methods of discourse you were using? This was not a quantitative paper, but so was it, well,
I'm not sure I can tell you all of that. My conjecture is that the economics profession as a whole, and what those we economists in business school had been doing, especially those of us who came out of Chicago, had carried on this tradition of thinking, as I said earlier, about the firm as a simple maximizing entity, a black box that maximized profits or value, depending on your point of view. And now there have been other people struggling with this issue. It was called whole field transactions cost economics. It got started with Armin Alchian, Coase, Ronald Coase, and then Armin Alchian and Oliver Williamson came along, and others, George Stigler. But there was something about the way we did that paper that left people helpless, that you could no longer treat the firm as this simple maximizing entity, and you could no longer count on competitive markets to make any inefficiencies or conflicts of interest go away. It wouldn't happen. It couldn't happen. And the argument was airtight. And if you looked out at the world, it sort of made sense of a lot of stuff. As a fact, in that paper, in one of the sections, we basically invented the notion of private equity, saying, if it's so costly to do it this way, why aren't there a few managers with a very large amount of equity, but the equity itself being small and a very large amount of debt on the outside. Now, unfortunately, the other people went on to do private equity. Those days it was called leveraged buyouts, and Bill and I just wrote about them, much to the detriment of our wealth. But nobody likes to change their ideas, scientists, about the structure of the world. And that paper forced people to change their ideas, or presented them with the challenge that they had to change, and the initial reaction was not to change. I'll give you a little more. For example, it implied that the brilliant work that had played a very important role just a few years earlier, Miller and Modigliani. Mert Miller was on my thesis committee, Franco Modigliani at MIT, with their theorems on capital structures and dividends. They basically said that the capital structure doesn't matter and dividend policy doesn't matter. And the context of our paper made very clear that all of those things were wrong, not that the proofs were wrong. Under the assumptions they made, that worked, but under any realistic description of what was going on in the world, those theorems were wrong as a description of how firms actually behaved. So those papers and those theorems were enormously important to getting the new finance started, along with Markowitz and Sharp. But it was time that we abandon that and go underneath it. You could no longer assume that investment policy was fixed and independent of the capital structure and independent of dividends. And it was that assumption that was buried in their arbitrage arguments, that the cash flows that are being generated for the firm, by the firm, wouldn't change with respect to its capital structure or its dividend policy. And that's where the mistake got made. So that when you allow that dependence, which is clearly what we were showing, so that causes people to have to give up a whole lot. And I was at a conference, I don't know, 7 or 8 years ago on business education at the University of Toronto, and there were, 15 or 20 major scholars in the room. I don't remember how, but we got to talking about this phenomenon that somebody, I don't know, it may have been me or somebody else, mentioned the fact that their best paper got rejected, or their best papers usually got rejected. And that story was true for every single person in that room. And they were all stars. Me not counted, of course. But so this is not an unusual phenomenon, and it's very important when we're bringing up doctoral students and young faculty. And I spent a large part of my time tutoring doctoral students and young faculty, getting them to see that if they ever really did invent something new, it was going to be rejected. And you had to be willing to stand in the face of that rejection and deal with the problems that the referees were having with the paper, the problems that your colleagues were having in dealing with it. And if you can stand in the face of that rejection, If the arguments are valid, you will eventually win. But that's a very uncomfortable place to be lots of times.
Can you talk a little bit about that and how you felt when you started to see Michael Milken do leverage takeovers and the beginnings of the first LBOs,
I was
the
overjoyed.
market for corporate control?
Well, the market for corporate control, had gotten started. That term was coined by Henry Manny, who at that time was a colleague in the political science department at the University of Rochester. And there were several of the doctoral students in the business school at Rochester that had set off, did some very innovative work. Richard Ruback and Peter Dodd and Richard Leftwich did work on the market for corporate control, looking at tender offers. It was all about this time. I can't remember the exact sequencing of it. And the point of the Jensen-Meckling agency paper, I always thought, was, yes, here is the source, when you break open the black box, of all of these problems and difficulties that are going to lead firms to behave in ways that destroy value, or at least not create as much value as they could. Bill and I saw it as a very positive thing, because the whole message of the paper was, these are the ways that you can structure it, to begin to think about structuring it to reduce these problems. Right. And that if you could resolve this conflict of interest between any pair of these agents, managers and bondholders, managers and shareholders, bondholders and shareholders, it would be worth you expending resources to resolve at least partially those problems, because you could create value by eliminating the unnecessary destruction of value that was taking place. So some interpreted it as a very pessimistic view. We interpreted it as a very optimistic view, and it was consistent with everything Bill and I ever did, which was all about how to make the world a better place. He was the dean of a business school. We were teaching business. We should be creating and teaching students how to create more value, not less. So we were describing the way the world was. And obviously it was a joy then to see the market for corporate control blossom in the 70s and then in the 80s, and it became very controversial. And in the early 80s, then leverage buyouts got to be formed, in which outfits like these various leverage buyout shops specialized in holding all of the equity virtually, with some of it in the hands of the managers, financed almost entirely with debt. Companies that had very stable cash flows, very little growth, generating lots of what I later came to call free cash flow, that in the hands of the normal business firms with highly disorganized shareholders, the managers ended up wasting those free cash flows, and this was a way to get them paid out. And by my estimates and others who did work in the day, that really became a big deal when the value destruction from the conglomerates had gotten to the point that it was approximately half of the total value of those firms. And that's a number we know, maybe a little less than that, but from what the premiums were that paid and the value that got created as the conglomerates got driven out of business. And then you had this thing with what is now called private equity, where firms were taken out of the public market entirely and held privately, some of them to put them back public later, some of them to go private and stay private, with enormous gains in efficiency. By that time I was at Harvard and had an opportunity to go around and write cases on those things and videotape their board meetings, and there wasn't any doubt. Now, it did create value, and there could be mistakes made.
Right.
And when you get mistakes made, then value gets destroyed.
It's been my great honor and pleasure to interview Michael Jensen for the AFA's series of historical interviews.